Dr. Gloria Frederick, host of Voices of We the People. I'm glad you could join us today. You know, as I always say as we begin our discussions, we the people comes from the preamble of the United States Constitution, and it signifies that we the people are responsible for government, not the other way around. So I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to talk about our usual stuff, which is talking about what's going on in the community. This is kind of a departure, so to speak, because we're going to be talking with a numbers person, and we don't usually have numbers people talking about issues, but I think it's important that we do because right now we're in a kind of chaotic situation with our elections. And so we really need to understand what it is we need to do as community residents, as voters. And Harman Drudge is going to be so helpful to us today to talk about that. Harmon is the data director for New Jersey. I'm sorry, North Carolina. I have New Jersey on my mind today. For North Carolina's Democratic Party, and he has consented to be our podcast guest. And I don't know if this is usual for him, but I want to have him talk about what he does, how the numbers make sense for us as voters and what we can do with those numbers. So, Harmon, let's just start with let's give our listeners some background on who you are and how you started doing the work that you do.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me on, Gloria. Uh, so I've been working in data analytics on campaigns and for the Democratic Party for the last decade. I started in the home state where I grew up, which was New Hampshire, during the presidential primaries in 2015 and 2016. There was just a niche that I felt like I could fill. And so ever since then, I've gone all across the country working on campaigns, focusing on data from anywhere from California to Maine. Um, my job, if I had to describe it, is basically turning voter data into strategy, kind of helping candidates spend their time and resources in the smartest way possible. And at the end of the day, my job is basically to help campaigns figure out who to talk to, where to focus, and how to win.
And that's really an important matter because this year we are so focused on trying to get people to turn out to vote. And these numbers help us to figure out where we need to go if we're campaigning, and as voters, what we need to know and do so that we can increase turnout. That's what we're talking about today, increasing turnout. It's going to be a turnout election, and so we have to be very aware of what we need to do in order for that turnout to be a turnout that gets us to one to the ballot box, and two to have a winning strategy and to have a winning outcome. So, having established that, could you talk a little bit about what you actually do, what the data guy does for the Democratic Party?
Yeah. Um, we basically going into some of the things that I'm doing just this very week with the primaries coming up is
That would be
making
great.
sure that people are who use our voter tools know what to say to voters in regards to where they can vote. What's most important at the end of the day is making sure voters know where they need to go to vote. I'm a numbers guy. I'll give you a number right now. Pretty much 1 in 5 polling locations has had a change. Basically 1 in 5 precincts has had a change in polling locations in the last couple of years. That means that basically 1 in 5 locations where someone might vote has changed in the last couple of years. And so these things happen very often. They happen all the time. And making sure that people are aware of that and making sure that is being put into our system. So when our candidates are talking to voters, not only are they able to target who they need to target so they can go vote, but also they have the correct information so that they can go and tell them where they need to go vote. Um, Outside of that, my job is managing something that is basically a voter file database. It is a list of the voters as well as some information on the voters, such as public accessible information from the voter rolls, like their phone number and their contact information, their address, and being able to take all of that information and outside data to basically give our candidates a way to know who needs to be talked to and how they need to be talked to. What I mean by that is that there are certain people that need to be talked to turn out to go vote, and there are certain people that need to be talked to be convinced to vote in the first place, as well as to vote for our Democratic candidate. And so being able to give campaigns the tools they need to successfully know who those voters are and where to reach them is a part of my job.
So tell me, how do you determine which voters you try to target and the voters that are likely to respond to the work that you do in terms of the numbers and um, getting that information to the candidates?
Yeah. Um, if I had to simplify an example to give, let's talk about turnout score. So it's just a fancy word for a little thing I give to each of the campaigns, which essentially places a number on a voter from 1 to 100. And what that is it's an algorithm that we make that looks at that voter's registration date. It looks at when they last voted. It looks at all of their vote history, as well as a couple other external factors. And it plants on them a number between 1 and 100 on their likelihood to vote. If we lined up 100 people and all of them had a 50 turnout score, 50 of those 100 people would actually go vote. And we've seen this in the data, and that's how we build these out. And so a campaign could use this to say target people who are kind of like a mid-level, like they don't always turn out, but they sometimes do, and just target those people with, say, some words to maybe convince them to actually go and vote. And this is an important election, make sure they know their locations to go vote. And that is one of the ways we target them and be able to use that data. Going into the second part of your question, who we actually target, it depends on the circumstances. We would want to do a turn, we would want to be convincing people to turn out if they are, likely high support for a Democrat, which we use other algorithms to kind of figure out that information. As well as we might be wanting to convince somebody who votes in every single election, but we're not really sure if they're going to be supporting us to convince them to just vote for us as opposed to turning out because they're already going to turn out. We know that from the data. And then in regards to being able to use that data so that we can actually make good decisions and check to make sure that we're not wasting our time on people, it's really about using these tools like an ecosystem. All of the campaigns communicate with each other post primary so that we are able to know if somebody knocked on your door and you told them that you are never going to vote for anything, you're not going to turn out and vote. Other campaigns get that information so that they might not waste their time on that door. Another example is that maybe we knock on somebody's door and the person at the door tells us that person moved. Then that information goes to all the other campaigns. And long term, because everybody's putting into the same database, we're able to effectively target people in a way that makes sense and is not wasting our time or campaigns' times. Once we know somebody's moved, we're not going to waste our time on that door. Once we know that, say, the house is inaccessible, there's like a no trespassing sign, we're not going to take time to knock on those doors. We'll instead make calls to that door. And so over time, this information builds up to make a really effective tool that makes it very helpful for campaigns to use.
How do you get that information to like the precincts and the counties so that they can make really good use of the information that you are providing?
Yeah. So part of what I do is to simplify it, I do a lot of coding on the back end to make sure that that pieces of information get sent to the county parties or the local candidates, vote builders. Votebuilder, as a reminder, is our voter file database for people who might not be familiar with it that the Democratic Party uses. And so what I do is I make it so that if somebody knocks on that door, I do a little coding on the back end to make sure that somebody in a different campaign post primary gets that information so they know to not waste their time if that person has like a no trespassing sign or somebody's moved. We also add helpful information, like if they're saying that they're a massive supporter of, say, the U.S. Senate candidate Cooper, you get that information as the local city councilor knocking doors, because maybe that person might also be a supporter of the Democratic city councilor candidate.
Oh, great. Now, let me ask you this because I'm sort of at the crossroads of saying, I think what you're saying makes sense. The analytics makes sense. If you were taught, I'm a voter, so pretend I'm not. And and so if you're talking to me, um, I haven't voted in the last primary. How would your data help me to understand what's going on and make a decision, maybe?
Yeah, so a lot of the data that we use isn't necessarily meant to be aimed at it. A lot of the data we use, I'll phrase like this, is meant to be assisting the candidates and campaigns to know
Hmm.
how to talk to people more so than actually being able to assist the voter themselves. I'll put it to you like this. We do two different things for a voter that maybe doesn't vote that often. Number one, I think the most valuable thing is getting that voter to be bought into how valuable their vote is. There are a lot of local elections that were won by a hair-thin margin last year in 2025 for the municipal races. And being able to talk about that and the fact that we have an incredibly close US Senate race and probably an incredibly close Supreme Court race, uh, similar to what happened with Riggs, I think is the first thing we need to be doing when we're talking to voters. Uh, Riggs, who won her race by a little over 700 votes in a statewide race, is just like the slimmest of margins. Every single vote mattered. Basically, seven people deciding not to go vote in each of the counties determined that race. That is how close. Less than one person per precinct decided how like who won that race. That's how big a deal it is. And so um, making sure people are bought into voting is I think the most important part of that when you're talking to a voter, and making sure they have that information is something we want to give that voter. I'll phrase it like that. Uh,
Hmm.
the other part of it is there's a terminology called deep canvassing. It's a fancy term that just basically means that we're going to go to your door and we're going to talk to you and you're going to tell us why you don't want to vote, why you don't usually vote, what issues matter to you that maybe somebody's not dealing with. And so that's the first part of that deep canvassing of us going to your door, maybe sometime in February before the general election in November, finding out why you would turn out to vote, just directly asking you those things, getting those issues down, and then coming down the road, say a couple months from then, or even just making a phone call down the road and having more information on that particular issue as a policy. And that's the terminology of deep canvassing. You go first to ask what issues matter to you, and then you come back and say, hey, I know we talked a few weeks ago or a few months ago about this issue. Here is what my plan is as a candidate or as the Democratic Party on an issue platform based sentiment on that issue and why I think you should be voting for me. And so that is deep canvassing because you're going there at the start and then you're coming back later. The voter usually feels heard because at the end of the day, people are not feeling heard. And it's very authentic because it is very personalized and it is coming back to them with a specific issue that they had and actually having that conversation and leveling with them about it. Uh, Voters really want, number one, to feel heard, to feel listened to, and number two, they're looking for authenticity above all else. And so
This is
deep
from
canvassing
from
is
their
very
local
powerful.
candidates.
Yeah.
This is from their local candidates.
Yes. And that's the other thing is the local candidates have such a bigger impact because they can talk about some of the local issues that most people as like, the kitchen table level of politics that they're looking for.
Hmm. Hmm. One of the things I've been working on as we've talked and before then, we're talking about trying to establish a community of voters. So, which means that it's our neighbors, it's our family, it's our friends.
Mhm.
So how do we use what you're doing, and it's great information. How do we share that with our community and our neighbors and our friends as a way to encourage them to get out and vote, to talk about issues and how they are are using that information that you're giving them to, kind of propel them to the polling places.
Um, Having a robust local organization that turns out voters is kind of like brushing your teeth. You have to do it consistently, or else it's not going to matter as much. And what I've seen be really, really successful in other counties, not just in North Carolina, but actually in places like New York, and Kentucky, is this movement on a local level to basically go neighbor to neighbor, as it's phrased.
Hmm.
Be able to have a set precinct chair or someone in that precinct that owns that precinct, and they go yearly to everybody on their particular turnout list each year for their precinct. What that ends up doing 1 or 2 years in is because that person owns knocking on those doors and they're responsible for it, they become known in the community. It becomes a rapport. A lot of people aren't really interested in opening their door to a stranger in 2026. But
Yeah.
if, Harmon goes and knocks on your door for the last 3 years and you begin to build a rapport with me, they're going to be more willing to answer the door, which means more conversations, which means more accessibility to make sure people are turning out because there's a peer pressure to talking to your neighbors about it. And ultimately, it builds up this system because every year you put information into our systems, the
Hmm.
information gets better. We know who never opens the door. We should try calling them instead. We know who always opens the door and has told us they support us. We should actually reach out to them at the start and see if they want to volunteer with us. And so as you go by, your lists get better and you build a rapport of community from this. Oh, it's Gloria. She's coming by just like every year to remind us to go vote. That's super helpful. And it becomes a very friendly, community driven thing. And so organizing from the grassroots up is definitely the way to go. And doing it on a precinct level where people are assigned that precinct yearly is
Hmm.
definitely something I've seen be very successful in the past.
That's really excellent ideas. I have to go back for a minute. You mentioned that some of the precincts, the voting precincts, the sites close.
Mhm.
How do we find out about it? First of all, how do you find out about it? And then how do we find out about it?
Yeah, so in the last 2 years, there's been almost 400 precinct changes for same day
Really?
elections. Uh, that's just a pretty common thing. So a couple things happen. Number one, precincts change. Literally, precincts will be condensed. So they'll take two precincts and they'll make them into one. Sometimes precincts split. They'll take one precinct and split it into two. And so objectively, polling locations have to change with that because usually there's one precinct per polling location. What we have seen is that sometimes the polling locations will have to be closed because there's just not enough funding to be able to keep it open. Sometimes there's just not enough capacity of volunteers to be able to manage it. And then other times there's just things happen, life happens. I've seen floodings happen from a storm the few days before and they
Mhm.
have to change it, things like that. But at the end of the day, over a year or two, these things happen consistently to a point that it becomes basically 1 in 5 polling locations have changed in the last 2 years. Um, and so that is something that you see happen a lot in counties where there's either a lot of growth or a lot of loss of population. And so, when you're talking about Mecklenburg, you'll see a lot of new precincts and polling location changes. When you're talking about some of the more rural areas out west and out east, you're going to see some polling locations shut down because the local county board of elections doesn't have capacity to run it. And so they condense it and consolidate it to being multiple precincts in one polling location. Um, and what we do is we get this information from the state board of elections and we make sure that number one, it's accurate, and number two, everybody has access to it. If you ever go to iwillvote.com, which I know the Democratic Party talks about a lot, and a lot of other people talk about going to iwillvote.com, I'm the one that puts the data in for North Carolina for I Will Vote. And
Okay.
part of what I do is I make sure that it's accurate. So we, just like anybody else, the State Board of Elections and the local county board of elections are fallible. And so there's a quality control process we do before we put it in there to make sure that people have the right information. And what we do see is that sometimes the local county board of elections or even the state board of elections can be fallible about this and the information is incorrect. And so it's our job to make sure that people know about it and that also the local board of elections and SBOE is aware that they should probably take that off their website because it's wrong.
We are talking with Harman Drudge, who is the data director for North Carolina Democratic Party. We're going to take just a couple of minutes and let him get some water and let me introduce a few things, and then we'll be right back. You are listening to Voices of We the People, a podcast for listeners of Eastern North Carolina. And you might be asking what's going to be on our next agenda, our next podcast. It actually is talking about creating a voting community. And we're going to be talking with Marcus Thompson of Democracy North Carolina. And we should have a real rip roaring kind of conversation because he's been working in communities for many years and he can bring us some really good information about how we reach out to our community as Harmon has just been talking about. And so we want to, I want you to join us as we listen to him. And the other thing I want to know is if you have some ideas about podcast guests or comments about our podcast, just go to info@wethepeople.com and you will be able to send us an email and we will immediately respond to you. Now, I think that we want to talk a little bit with Harmon about what's going on in Eastern North Carolina, since that's our focus. Um, Harmon made a really interesting comment earlier about how we their data has made a difference in getting like mayors to get voted in as opposed to get voted out, and also what's going on in the community in Eastern North Carolina. So if we could just talk to Harmon a little bit about that, and then we'll spread the conversation back to a more broad conversation. So, Harmon, what's going on in data-wise in Eastern North Carolina?
Yeah. So what we've seen in the last couple decades, and if people are familiar with Eastern North Carolina, they'll know about this, is there's been a reduction of just people in a lot of these counties. The counties have become more rural over time. And while North Carolina overall is growing, Eastern North Carolina has been losing a little bit of population. What you're also seeing is that the people in remaining in Eastern North Carolina as a percentage are becoming more conservative voters. What I mean by that is Trump is winning more votes over time in places like Eastern North Carolina. This is, to be fair, specific to certain counties, mind you, but that is what we're seeing overall. Another thing to take into note is if you're familiar with Don Davis um, and his congressional district, what you'll also see is that they are further gerrymandering the congressional districts. Um, Approximately 40,000 African American voters net were lost from the congressional district that Don Davis is in because of the change. And what was taken into their place was about 40,000 conservative white voters. These are approximations, but we do know where certain demographics lean in their votes, and we know where certain congressmen get a lot of their voting pool from. And it was very clear that they were basically taking out and diluting a lot of the African American population's vote power in this congressional district and adding in uh, a more conservative leaning population in its stead. Um, so what you get from all of this is that over time, we're seeing in Eastern North Carolina, it's becoming more red. And a lot of the places where more blue Democratic voters had a say in politics on a congressional district are losing their power and their voice in Congress because of that, unfortunately. Um, what we're seeing, though, is that people are very upset at this administration, and what you're seeing is actually a pendulum swing to the left. This is pretty common after president of the opposing party wins. So when Donald Trump, a Republican, won, you're going to see a pendulum shift to the left, which is what we saw in New Jersey and Virginia, and what we also saw in North Carolina. Just to give you some facts, Farmville is a really great example. Farmville is a small town in Pitt County in Eastern North Carolina. Every single precinct of Farmville went for Donald Trump. It was kind of a battleground district, but
Mm.
every single precinct went for Trump. What we saw is that Farmville was a mayoral flip from a Republican mayor to a Democratic mayor in every single precinct. And so there basically was a Republican incumbent for mayor there that lost to a Democrat. What we see overall in the entire state is that everywhere swung left. Arguably, we were at a low point in 24, so it made sense that things were going to swing left. If they weren't swinging left, it means that we were going even further to the right, which is a scary thought. But what you did see is that pendulum swing go that we consistently see when a presidential candidate of the opposing party wins. And so that is very encouraging for 2026. It tells me that between the fact that we are getting more organized as a state party and county parties, and that we are getting these vote swings to the left from 24, that we're likely going to see that pendulum continue up until 26 as the final flow of that process. Um, Outside of that, there's some issues I'd love to bring to your attention about Eastern North Carolina that just might make it harder to vote in general, though.
Please bring those issues to
Yeah.
our attention.
So a couple of things to go through are number one, there is a law on the books from 2003 that is an acronym of basically just saying HAVA. So HAVA voters, it's basically a law that made it so that there were additional requirements to register to vote. And there are a lot of people in North Carolina who were essentially grandfathered in to vote before those requirements came in. Basically, it was just a bunch of additional information that they didn't need to provide before 2003 that you now need to add in to register in North Carolina. What ended up happening is that there's a bunch of folks in the state that need to still update their information. And a lot of them, as a percentage, are predominantly in Eastern North Carolina. So, what do I mean by this? These are folks who are on the voter rolls, who are legally on the voter rolls, mind you, but they just need to provide a little bit more information or they may lose the ability to vote down the road. And what we saw is that of these 120,000 people that were tagged as this in July, that almost 80,000 of them were likely Democratic supporters. And I think it was like 50 or 60,000 were African American voters, predominantly in Eastern North Carolina. A lot of these people are actually unaware of this issue, and I'm hoping that that'll be resolved when they go to the polls and they're notified about it. And we're doing our best to actually reach out to these folks, but that is something that we're seeing in Eastern North Carolina that they're being affected by. On top of that, are you familiar with the SAVE Act that's currently going through Congress?
Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so the SAVE Act in its current form is probably going to get rejected by the Supreme Court because of how ridiculous it's set up.
Do you think it's
There's
going to
a
pass the
number of things.
Senate?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I said, do you think it's going to pass the Senate?
I can't speak to that. I'm so focused on North Carolina, I haven't really been looking at it, but
Mm-hmm.
stranger things have happened with this administration, and
Yes,
I
it
wouldn't
is.
be shocked. But what we are seeing that we know is going to affect this state is one of the more ridiculous parts of the act is that you need to make sure that your birth certificate lines up with your current legal ID. So let's say you might have a driver's license, but you may have taken your husband's last name. That doesn't match your birth certificate. you're going to have some difficulties in that process. Um, Turns out most people who take their partner's last name are women. And it turns out that most that women, as a majority, vote for the Democratic candidates that are on the ballots. It's not necessarily targeted at Democratic voters, but it is targeted systematically in a way that it affects Democrats much more than it affects Republicans. That's one of the more ridiculous parts of this bill. There's a couple other things in it that's just going to make it a lot more difficult and just creating a larger and longer process for people who constitutionally have the ability to vote. And essentially, what it is doing in some parts of this country is making a poll tax, where you're going to basically need to either get a passport or additional information that you don't necessarily need to have if you don't already have it, and legally you don't necessarily need it to be able to vote. And so they're looking to change that law to make it so that you basically have to either buy a passport or go through a lot of these processes that are just going to tie people up. There is a terminology called it's basically a voter index, and it was made by a national organization. I believe it's the ACLU, and it essentially is how difficult it is to vote on a state level. They take into account a bunch of things, like how accessible is it to go and register to vote? How accessible is it to actually show up and vote? Do you have early vote? Can you mail in ballots? Do you have long hours to actually go vote, or is it very, very finite and you only have, like, say, 1 day to early vote as opposed to like 2 weeks? And they take all of that as well as, how far it is to go to the nearest DMV per population. And they take all of this to basically make an index for a voter. And what you're seeing is throughout the country, that voter index is going to go down. And by that, I mean it's going to be
Mm.
harder to vote. And so that's ultimately what they're doing is they're trying to make it more difficult to vote because they know these policies predominantly affect people who are likely going to vote against their interests of the Republicans, and also are just going to make it a lot more difficult to vote where a lot of these working folks are just not going to have time to go turn out now because they're going to have to go through this whole process before election day. And they either are not going to realize that they need to do these things, or they're going to realize that they're too busy working to actually go do these things to be able to have a voice in their local elections.
In our precinct meeting a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about this whole business of having to identify yourself. And I don't think that that was originally a part of how you register to vote, but now it is.
Yeah,
To
and
get an
that's what
ID,
HAVA is basically you
is that
needing
what
to
it
have
is?
some additional information.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's more to it than that, but there's a bunch of more information that they just required. I don't have it on hand right here, but if people wanted to look up HAVA Act, you can see all of the information for it.
That's HAVA Act,
Yes.
right? Okay. I'll put it on our website. Because we were saying that you didn't used to have a photo ID, but now you do. And then to try to find out where you get a photo ID is another issue all by itself.
Mhm. And what ends up happening is that there's actually some counties that don't even have necessarily a DMV. And so you have to go to a different county to even get your registry. Like it's a whole other process. And so it's not accessible in some of these more rural places, including Eastern North Carolina. And then going back to the SAVE Act, where in regards to women's names, what we're actually seeing is it's looking like around like 40% of registered women in Eastern North Carolina are going to have an issue because they don't have the same name as what's on their birth certificate on their legal license. So basically, 2 out of 5 women are going to have this issue in places like Pitt and Halifax County and Martin County. And even all the way up in places like Currituck and Camden, it's looking like 3 out of 5.
That's amazing. It's also pretty diabolical
Yeah.
that women particularly are targeted this way. Um, Before we go, I would like to give you an opportunity to tell everybody how important what you do is. Now, we've been talking about it. We've covered a bunch of areas. And so I don't want to put words in your mouth as if that's possible. But anyway, I just want to know, in terms of the work that you do, what do you consider the most important thing that you're able to accomplish?
Um, if I had to condense it, just making it so that being able to talk to voters is as accessible to campaigns as possible. Um, what I really do at the end of the day is make sure that campaigns are spending their time where it really counts. More conversations with real people, better outreach in underserved communities, and fewer voters ultimately slipping through the cracks. And so every single day, part of my job is really just how can we make this easier for folks? Because it's not easy for a lot of campaigns to reach out to voters.
Right.
It's a lot of a process. And so making it as friendly and as easy to use as possible so that is accessible. Because it's not just from the voter side, it's from the campaign side. Making sure it's accessible to talk to their voters matters so that they can get their message out. So it's truly a democracy of ideas.
I think that's important too. The other thing that you do, I think, is making information available through vote builders to local election folks and to the counties and to the precincts so that they know how to talk to each other and to their neighbors and friends. And I think that's an important piece of the information that you do provide is so important because um, we sometimes we're kind of left out in left field about what to do and what to say.
Yeah. I I'm sure there are people who feel like I don't get back to their emails or email enough, but I'm sure there's a number of people who feel like I email too much and I think that's a good problem.
I think it is too. I think it is too. Um, we've been listening to a very interesting, I think, conversation. Harmon has given us so much information to feast on and to use. Um, I just have one question. With respect to Don Davis, what do you see, even with all of the gerrymandering that he's gone through? And I think this is like the second or third time that what do you
Yeah.
see happening and what might we do to help him?
So I can't speak to what his odds look like in the general, because I'm still focused on making sure that everybody has what they need to be successful for the primaries. So I haven't really looked at the general too much on that district.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I know that what is best for them to do is we're going to have a number of statewide races and a high tide floats all boats, and so making sure that we're engaging with everybody and working together to make sure that we're knocking doors and talking about all the candidates, I think is a good thing for Don Davis. And so going out there and making sure that people know from all the way from the US Senate race down to your local city councilor and also your congressional race is going to be really, really important. And that's the best thing people can do. A lot of these new counties that Don Davis district comprises of now don't really know him. And Don Davis actually does a really, really good job of talking to moderate and conservative voters. But moderate and conservative voters that have never been in his district before don't know as much about him as they might. And so going to focus on those particular counties is definitely going to be step one to make sure he gets known because he is objectively well liked by the community, um, or else he wouldn't have won so many times.
Right,
And so
right.
making sure people know about him in some of these newer places, I think is going to be very valuable. So focusing on those counties that are new in there. And if you need help with that, you always can get into Votebuilder, and I'm happy to send you those counties.
Oh, that's excellent. You mentioned sort of a reversal that's been quietly happening, and it has to do with mayors, uh, uh, Democratic mayors flipping seats.
Mhm.
Uh, how how much mm, How much do you see that happening, and what can we do in Eastern North Carolina to facilitate that?
Yeah, I think that I go back, and this isn't necessarily municipal, but let's look at Texas with the special elections recently. If we have the same amount of change in vote percentage as the Texas specials had, every single state house seat in Eastern North Carolina will have a Democrat in it. And so
Really?
I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. But because that would be the high water mark objectively. But what you
Mm-hmm.
would what I would say is that there are a lot of places that were lost by a couple hundred votes, a couple thousand votes, and proportionally only like a couple percentages or even only 10%. And all of those races are game to be flipped this cycle. There's a terminology, it's called field margin. It's just a fancy way of saying how effective is field knocking on doors and making calls to voters for a campaign. On a presidential, the field margin, how much knocking on doors and making calls can change the race, is a percentage of like 1%. There'll be a
Really?
1% difference if Kamala Harris never knocked on any doors or made calls. The turnout, and this is debated, but the turnout would be a differential of like 1 or 2%. But when you're talking about a local city council race, it's 10% because a lot of people are uninformed about the local races. So being able to go out there and talk to voters about your race and why you're passionate about running is the most effective thing people can do. And that's why some of these races are easily winnable. There's a lot of people who are really upset with the Republican Party that are aligned with local candidates that are Democrats' policies. Making sure that you are known and your voice is heard is really important because people will vote for the Senate race, they'll vote for the Supreme Court, they'll vote for Don Davis for Congress, and then they'll stop filling out the ballot because they just don't know the rest of the people. So making
Mm-hmm.
sure your name is known and making sure that people understand that there are Democrats south of the list of congressional candidates is valuable. And it is the difference between winning these races and losing. So making sure people vote all the way is important.
I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your passion. I mean, we can tell that this is something you love to do, and so I really thank you for sharing the time that you've given to us, and now you can actually go on your honeymoon. And I appreciate that very much. We've been speaking with Harman Drudge, who is the I want to say Maven, but he's a data director for North Carolina Democratic Party. He's very good at what he does. Is there a way that people can reach you, Harman?
Yeah, if people are interested and they are candidates that are registered Democrats, you're more than welcome to apply for Votebuilder. Just email me at hdroge@ncdp.org and we'll help connect you.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much. I really have appreciated this conversation. And before we go, there are a few things I wanted to share with our listeners. One is to remind you that this is African American history, started out as Black History Month. And so there are a couple of things that we might want to talk about in our conversation. And one of them has to do with the origin, oh, excuse me, of Black history. And also that believe it or not, we had the first self-made millionaire was Madam C.J. Walker, who uh, s- developed hair products and sold them, and she was our first self-made millionaire woman, African American. And so I want to also say that remember what we say about Dr. King, described the vote as the most powerful instrument for breaking down injustice and destroying walls that imprison men based on their differences. I am so glad that you joined us. I am Dr. Gloria Frederick, your host, saying thank you. And I'll see you next time on Voices of We the People. And I do want to thank our podcast team, uh, Tamika Robinson and James Frederick. They are the way that we get this information out to you. And so I thank them every time we have a conversation. Until we meet again. Again, I'm Dr. Gloria Frederick, your host, and I thank you for listening to Voices of We the People.